Now we're going to zoom in on supply chain partnerships specifically. So new business models have come a long way in addressing medical distribution challenges in low and middle income countries. One example is Zipline, which you've heard a lot about today so far. Another example you might not know about is called Via Global Health, started by Noah Perin, who's based in Seattle and joining us today. I want to bring our three panelists to the stage. Come on up. And we're going to have a discussion on how the global health community can better engage with these entrepreneurial models. So please join me in welcoming Brittany Hume from Zipline, Noah Perin from Via Global Health, and Prashant Yadav, a supply chain expert now at the Center for Global Development, who was for a long time at the Gates Foundation. Thank you. So I actually want to start with Brittany. Zipline has come up a few times today. I think when it comes to approaches to partnership, you certainly have some lessons you can share. So can you just talk about what are the partnerships that have been really meaningful for Zipline and allowed you to scale in Rwanda and on to Ghana, as we heard? And yet, what challenges have you faced? Who are you looking to partner with now?
Absolutely. Partnerships are at the center of Zipline and our operations and business model. We are operating in countries that oftentimes their national health systems in some ways are public-private partnerships. They have development partners that are there helping them to create, design, execute strategies for health access and equity. And so we recognize that if we want to be plugging into that and enabling more access across those countries, then we need to be bringing a way for each of those partners to actually get involved in that objective. Some of the partners that we have had from the beginning who bet on a crazy idea of a drone company that had never done this before are the Gates Foundation and Gavi. UPS Foundation was also an early partner. I think in those partnerships, really what they saw was the potential to try something new that was at a scale that was different than some of the other drone implementations or innovations that they were seeing. I think they had the idea of systems change in mind from the very beginning and saw that there would be a road to get there. Along the way, we've also brought in other partners like Pfizer, Novartis, who have helped us to transfer that innovation into new geographies like Ghana, and then also once that system is in place, to use that to create more access. So we are always looking for the partners who can help us to get to that next level. And I think some of the challenges there are it's really about in some ways partnerships are a chicken and an egg. And particularly when you have partnerships that involve national governments. I think some of these partners don't want to be seen as telling the governments what the answer is, and so they don't want to be too forthcoming in some of their support for certain innovations or even certain innovators within those. But there, it's if you wait too long, then we don't have a concrete ask for the governments, and that can really belabor the opportunity to get something going and to catalyze change.
Great, and we'll come back to you in a moment. A question for all of you I want to discuss is what forms of support beyond capital are needed for these models? And I know with the partners you mentioned, for some it's financing and for others it's other forms of support, so we'll get to that. But first I want to bring Noah into this. So Noah, when you and I first spoke about Via Global Health, I was fascinated to learn that part of the idea emerged from kind of an aha moment you had when you were at PATH, which is an organization we cover closely at Devex, a global health innovation NGO based in Seattle, for those of you who don't know. So can you just talk about what were you doing at PATH and what were the moments that led to what eventually became Via Global Health? And then maybe a few words on partners that have helped you get there.
Sure, absolutely. So at PATH, my role was to help look at different technologies and see what potentially would meet needs and what were the commercial requirements for those technologies to get out into the market. And so there's an enormous amount of resource and just passionate people who are developing technologies on a daily basis. I mean, I think when I did an assessment at one at one point, I had looked at over 48 technologies in a year, just looking at sort of different health areas and different fields and whatnot. So there's this immense just tidal wave, I think you had mentioned earlier, of innovation that's happening. But what became very apparent while I was there was that very little of it was actually getting out to where it needed to go. Like we weren't having the impact that we had all anticipated through the development of these technologies. And one of the bottlenecks there was the distribution, was that channel, was helping people become aware that these things exist in the first place, and then reducing the friction in the system so that people can actually get it. I think Dr. Quinn had mentioned that, two things. One, there are times where there are tools that she knows exist that she doesn't have, or there are times where the tools that she has are far more than they should be. And there's markup after markup after markup. And
Not fit for purpose
Right.
for what people are trying to do.
or just far too expensive, and doesn't need to be. So we really look at partnerships at VIA as more of, as an organization, we're an enabler. So how do we help our partners get their products to market? How do we help our customers get access to the tools that they need affordably? And so that aha moment at PATH was really, there's a need here where these technologies and these innovations aren't getting to where they're needed. There's probably not a mechanism within sort of the NGO world to be able to make that happen in a sustainable way. And we're in Seattle, we're sort of in the shadows of Amazon, and the idea was, well, here's a particularly good example of a company that has solved this in a massive way. Can we emulate them for global healthcare?
And so you sometimes have been referred to as sort of an Amazon of global health, but you picked a private sector model coming out of an NGO. And of course, both Zipline and VIA Global Health are private sector companies, two very different models tackling two very different problems in the supply chain, which is part of why I'm very glad to have Prashant here, because Prashant is an expert on global health supply chains. He actually joined us at Prescription for Progress in 2018. And I'm wondering, we've heard from Brittany, we've heard from Noah, we'll hear more from them in a moment, but most of these entrepreneurial models are funded through private capital, whether it's via Global Health or Zipline or other examples we could talk about. And you were the one who mentioned to me and kind of helped inspire this discussion that the global health community doesn't really have the toolkit it needs to engage with these models, which could bring so much value to this supply chain work. So can you talk about why is that such a challenging dynamic, and are you seeing any positive examples of funders beyond the world of private capital that have found a way to engage?
Yeah, thanks, Catherine. So I think, firstly, it's important to think about what is the value that is coming out of the new innovators in the distribution business. And I think one part to keep in mind is that the supply chain isn't just about delivering product to patient. It brings back very crucial data sets without which the idea of precision public health is infeasible.
Great point.
Right? So then it comes a question of how do we bring back data in shorter closed loops? And our mainstream channel of delivering product to patients is a government-run system, which is good at several things. It's good at equity, but its cycles of bringing back data about use, stock, who used it, is longer, whereas all of the innovators who are trying to solve this distribution challenge have much shorter cycles of bringing back data. So if we are real about precision public health, we need to think about how to bring back supply chain data more quickly, and most of the innovators are doing that. The second thing that's important is that I think Patrice mentioned earlier about too many intermediaries, markups in the system. So the whole area of disintermediating the supply chain has gone from being almost non-existent to tremendous amounts of technology and business model innovation. Lots of groups are doing that. But all of these are largely funded by private capital, like you said, and part of the reason is that there hasn't been a lot more global health financing or other development financing is that the modality of financing remains unclear. Are we putting money into a private for-profit company to deliver their objectives, our objectives? Yes, there is a Venn diagram. How do you illustrate that Venn diagram better? So one area which I think has received some traction is the idea that Left to private capital alone, some of the innovators might be keen to establish customer density in urban areas
Yeah.
for therapeutic areas which are more market feasible. And philanthropy and development finance could go into expanding their reach and accelerating their reach into rural or less customer density or therapeutic areas which are otherwise not feasible with private capital. And that's the role we want to see expanded.
So I want to hear from Brittany in response to that point, because Zipline, I think part of why it's so interesting to many people in this room and others in the global health community is you've attracted a lot of venture capital, but you are working in markets that, that return on investment might not be apparent to other VC-backed companies in Silicon Valley, right? How have other partners helped you to maybe accelerate your work in markets that aren't necessarily profitable? Or I think your argument might be you see them as profitable as well. So can you just talk about what is the mix of funder relationships, venture capital, grant capital, other forms of support that have allowed you to go into these markets?
Yes, I think that Zipline kind of sits in the middle of a Venn diagram of a lot of different stakeholders who sometimes don't even understand each other's language.
Yeah.
And that is, I think, a key role that we are sometimes caught in playing, right? There's venture capital, there's the governments and the government financing, particularly in developing markets. Then there's foundations, multilaterals, bilaterals. Everyone is deploying capital in a different way. And they all have different timelines. They all have different objectives. And so, going back to, I think, something that Marianne said from Merck from others before, how do you take all of these different objectives and goals and align them into a single implementation? And so what we find to be really exciting from the Zipline side is that actually we are able, in these countries like Rwanda and Ghana, to have large-scale impact, which is what a lot of the global health funders are really looking for, delivering critical and life-saving medical products, and learning all kinds of interesting things about real demand and data, as Prashant was referencing before. But we're also doing drone implementations and on-demand delivery and on-demand fulfillment across to the last mile to a degree that honestly no one else in the world is doing anywhere. And that is something that is really interesting and exciting to our venture capital partners. So I think as long as we are continuing to press ourselves to go as fast and as fast as we can, and to look in each of these different implementations, what is the correct set of objectives in each one of those geographies and use cases, then I think we are getting a bit more runway from each one of those sets of partners to say, okay, we see that you're managing to somehow do this. We're going to give you a little bit more room to run.
And Noah, I want you to jump in, and when you do, can you also talk about support beyond capital, what we were getting at earlier, who those scale partners have been for VIA?
Absolutely. I think an important distinction needs to be made when you're looking at sort of the funders, because we think of it as very much a continuum, and it's a balance that we have to have. Because you're right, there's the venture-backed investors, and when we talk to them, they're like, well, why aren't you working in the U.S.? That's where the money is.
Yeah.
That's where we're going to get our biggest return. And I think on the other end of the continuum is just straight up philanthropy and donor dollars. And a wise person at the Gates Foundation once told me that you have to be careful there too, because there you can get drawn. Your focus can be drawn away from what you need to do for the business to achieve the funders' objectives.
Yeah.
So like we might be in places and have the funding to build out in places that would not be sustainable for us as an organization. Like incredibly impactful, but wouldn't let us continue to grow and do what we need to do. So you have sort of those impact investors in the middle, sort of they're the hybrid.
Yep.
They're a little bit more challenging to navigate because they kind of live in both worlds. And you have to kind of figure out what their objectives are, and I think it takes a little bit longer. But we've been incredibly successful there. And what I found with working with some of these partners is that they do bring more than just the money.
Yeah.
They bring expertise either in the location and understand the markets that we're in because they're complicated. And we've delivered products to over 60 countries. Like we're throughout the world. It's a lot to keep track of. But also partnerships around how to build the business.
Yeah.
And sort of how to move the organization as a whole forward. And that's been honestly probably even more valuable than the funding.
And I know Prashant has been a thought partner for you in that. So I wish we had more time to discuss these issues, but I want to close with Prashant. And I'll ask you this. You mentioned that the global health community kind of lacks a toolkit to engage with entrepreneurial models like Via Global Health, like Zipline. And I'm thinking of someone in the audience who might think, well, this isn't my space. I don't work in the supply chain stuff, even though anything anyone in this room is working on will fail if this space is not stronger, right? So any final thoughts or calls to action on how to scale up models like these and what people in this room can do to support entrepreneurial models for supply chains?
Yeah, so two things. The first is I think those distribution innovators who are primarily providing a service to the government, their cost of customer acquisition is very high. The time for customer acquisition is very long. No startup can survive when it takes 18 months to convince a government stakeholder. And we've got to figure out a partnership model that helps the right kinds of technologies to get into government systems, find the right champions quicker. Those who are serving the private channel, which means those who are serving private pharmacies, wholesalers, that retail out-of-pocket market, they have to go to large pharmaceutical companies, and the local country office oftentimes says, I'm not equipped to answer this question. I will work with mainstream distributors, go to the HQ. And a small startup doesn't have the resourcing to go to HQ. So we have to find a platform to connect such groups with global pharmaceutical companies or life sciences companies quicker. And that's what I guess people in this room could probably help create.
Great. So come find our
I would
panelists
second that.
further. Yeah, perfect. And thirded?
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you all so much. Please join
Thank
me
you.
in thanking our panelists.